When Shari began the Rocky Mountain Children's Law Center, she was upsetting an institutional apple cart.
Her cause was something so many of us don't understand that even exists.
If I'm going to be a lawyer, I want to fight for kids. If we affect one child's life, all of this will have been worth it.
Children are safer in Colorado today because of Shari.
As strong and enduring as the Rocky Mountains they stood beside, as visionary as the views of the Grand Plains they looked across, the women inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame are trailblazers whose work has improved and enriched our lives. They are teachers, scientists, ranchers, leaders in business, education, religion, and the arts. Women who have been recognized for their many contributions to our state, our country, and the world. I'm Renelda Muse, and these are the stories of great Colorado women.
I was sitting in the back of a courtroom just observing. I had no role in this case. And what was unveiled in front of me was the story of this little 2-year-old who had been terribly neglected in his very first weeks of life. And this was a little guy that was blind and severely disabled. The parents were clearly incapable of raising this little boy, so was removed from his birth parents and placed in a foster home and lived with that foster family for 2.5 years. So I'm waiting for them to start talking about termination of parental rights and adoption, but nobody did. And all of a sudden, without prompting from anybody in the courtroom, the judge made a decision that the loving relationship that this little boy enjoyed with this foster family was interfering with the parents' rights and ordered his removal from that family, not to go back to his birth family, which would have been bad, but to go to another foster home, to go to strangers. So imagine that, 2.5, you're blind, you have developmental difficulties, you have lived with this wonderful family and thrived despite the obstacles. And somebody makes this decision that you're not going to understand at 2.5. And there was no transition. There was no notice to anybody. So I'm sitting there waiting for the child's lawyer to speak up and say, Your Honor, please, could you reconsider this? Silence. Nobody stood up. Nobody requested anything. Nobody asked to delay this. Let's have a hearing. Let's call an expert. Let's see how the child would be able to transition. None of that happened. And I walked out of that courtroom and I was committed to starting my own agency, and it was going to be about justice for kids. Now, I had no idea what that meant exactly, but I knew that's what I was going to do. That's what the work of Shari Shink and the Law Center has done, is said, focus on the child. That is a soul that we're dealing with. That is a human being.
Shari's an incredibly unique person, from her colorful hair to her colorful clothes. Shari makes you notice her, not for vanity's sake. She understands that she needs to cut through the noise in order to make folks care about a population of kids.
Kids who are in homes where they experience abuse or neglect, they really are some of the most vulnerable of people we have in our community.
Shari is a brilliant attorney.
At times she might be in a courtroom and she's watching something happen in a case that she's not involved with, and it really just kind of annoys her. This is what's going on is wrong. And Shari Shink will stand up from the audience and say, Your Honor, can I be heard? I can't think of another lawyer who would actually do that.
She can be so fierce that you don't want to be on the opposite side of her.
She took on a system and she changed it, and we're all better because of it.
That work, I hope, will have a lasting impact and continue to improve things within the system for children. As a group that were powerless, and if they weren't born into a happy, healthy family with people who loved and cared for them, then they were going to struggle and they were going to have unmet needs. And I wanted to be there in some capacity to address those unmet needs.
Because of of Shari, I feel like I've had the opportunity to live. I feel like I've been able to see the world and experience things that I wouldn't have otherwise experienced being in the foster care system. I am Shari's legacy.
I was born in Pennsylvania, and I grew up in the country. We were about 30 miles from Pittsburgh.
West Newton is a rural town in southwestern PA. It is your quintessential small town America.
My father actually built our home on the piece of property that we had. We had an acre of ground and lots of trees, lots of open spaces. We were always outdoors. So there were 3 of us in the family. I have an older sister and a younger brother. We're all 3 years apart.
My grandmother and grandfather are great people, but they couldn't be more different. My grandfather, very calm. My grandma, on the other hand, was sort of like a hurricane of emotion and energy. But I think you see them both in Shari. She has a perseverance and an inner calmness to be able to push through barriers and overcome challenges that I think she got from my grandfather. But she also dreams, I think, of a bigger life and to be able to create a big impact in the world. And that's something that comes in many ways from my grandmother.
They both were always very clear that we could do anything we wanted with our lives.
I don't think it was ever a question for Shari whether she was going to go to college. It was really sort of what she was going to find as her passion, what she was going to find as her life's work.
After being accepted at the University of Pittsburgh, I decided to actually go to a branch campus, and then I went to the main campus in Pittsburgh my junior year. I majored in psychology, not because I was compelled to work in that field. I think like a lot of young people, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and so I thought that was a pretty cool kind of course of study just to learn about human behavior and people. When I graduated, I thought, oh my gosh, what do I do in psychology? You really do have to get a master's or a doctorate degree to do reasonable things. So I thought, I think I'll go to law school. Perry Mason was behind my decision to go to law school. I remember very vividly, my father came home from work and we would always eat between 5 and 6 and my mom was calling me to dinner and I said, Mom, 5 more minutes, Perry Mason's on, I'll come in a minute. I just very comfortably walked into the kitchen and said, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to be a lawyer? And my mom never let me forget that. And so she encouraged me from that point forward. I never intended really to take a year off between college and law school, but as much as I was intrigued by the notion of being a lawyer, I really didn't know what I would do as a lawyer. Did I want to be a litigator? Did I want to work for a big company? Did I want to work at neighborhood legal services and represent poor people in matters of real important life issues? So I took a year to figure that out. I had this wonderful opportunity to work at this daycare center with kids. It was the days of the Office of Economic Opportunity, and so it was specifically targeted to poor single women with children. So I had 10 to 12 little kids from 3 to 5. And I had this idea that I wanted to put on a circus. And I wanted our daycare center to invite all of the other daycare centers in the area. And so my father created a circus tent out of our daycare center. So we had my dad making the props, my mom making the costumes, I taught them the dancing, and we opened this event up to all of these other little kids when we were doing the circus. And these kids were dancing. I was sitting on the floor like a dance teacher does, sitting on the floor and going, shuffle, ball, change, go that way, go that way. And literally kind of mimicking the steps in a way. And I had this epiphany and I thought, these are the kids I want to fight for because they have so much to offer and they have so much potential, but they're also incredibly powerless. And so that was my decision. It was like I was off and running. Generally speaking, I hated law school. I think there were 20 women in a class of 250. In the first week, they tell you, look to your left, look to your right. Only one of you are going to be here 3 years from now. I chose Rutgers because it was affordable, because it was a 5-hour drive from my family. and it was across the bridge from Philadelphia, and I loved Philadelphia. Graduating from law school and, okay, where am I working? What am I going to do? Do I stay in New Jersey? I had been clerking for a judge and really enjoyed working with him, but he didn't have any money. And so I applied for one job at Neighborhood Legal Services in Pittsburgh. I flew in for an interview. In the middle of the interview, I learned that the director of legal services started a children's advocacy program within Neighborhood Legal Services, which was unique in the nation. And when I found out about that in the middle of the interview, everybody told me that I just knocked their socks off because I was so enthusiastic talking about all of the things that I would do if I could be a part of the child advocacy division. And to his credit, Tony Weddick suggested that I get some experience under my belt in a more traditional lawyering capacity with adults, and then within a couple of years I could apply for a position there, which is exactly what I did. We had the monopoly on the representation of children in Allegheny County, which included the city of Pittsburgh, which means that we were representing thousands of kids every year. And on a given day, we were in court from morning till night. What I learned in front of the 3 judges I practiced in front of, so by the time I was litigating on behalf of children, Tony Weddick, who had run the legal services program, was now on the bench. And so was Patrick Tamilia and Livingstone Johnson. And those 3 judges were the judges that I appeared before for 4 years, pretty consistently, every single week with hundreds of cases. That was where I learned what was possible. And that was where I saw 3 jurists bend over backwards and do whatever it took to make the right decisions for the kids before them. After I had about a year in the Child Advocacy Division in Pittsburgh, there was an opportunity at the Kemp Center in Colorado, and there were 12 people from around the country selected to participate in a 6-month program where you basically worked every day with all of the incredible staff at the Kemp Center, being immersed in the work of abused and neglected children. So after that, I went back to Pittsburgh. Within a very short time, I was made the managing attorney of the Child Advocacy Unit. We were doing amazingly innovative things, and then got a call from the National Association of Counsel for Children, which is based here in Denver, and asked me if I would come to Colorado to run a 3-year federal demonstration project that compared and evaluated alternative models of legal representation for children. Now, it was designed for 3 years, but they only had 1 year of money, so they basically said they could only guarantee me 1 year. So I took a leave of absence from my job. They told me I could come back. I came to Colorado. I thought, how cool would that be? You know, I live in Colorado for a year, do what I can, and then go back home. Well, you can't really do much in a year. So I did raise the money for the 2 years that it was designed. And then at the 3-year point, I was still considering going back home. But during the federal demonstration project over 3 years, I met a lot of people. I knew a lot of people. And so I created a 501c3. I got a board of directors.
When Shari started the nonprofit, it was called the Children's Legal Clinic. And then years later, we came up with the Rocky Mountain Children's Law Center.
Our mission was to transform the lives of abused and neglected children and give them an opportunity to thrive.
Kids who are abused and neglected but find themselves in the system, they need the very best advocate. They need their own lawyer to think about what is, in fact, in the best interests of the children.
Her cause was something that I think so many of us don't understand that even exists out there.
I'm going to tell you about a little boy who, at birth, was born to a mom who suffered from schizophrenia. And she knew, to her credit, she knew that she couldn't raise her son. He was placed in a foster home and thrived. This is a little boy that was not abused or neglected. The foster family provided great care, and when he was about 10 months old, the foster family went to the Department of Social Services and asked if they could adopt. And they were told, of course, sure. When the court gets around to terminating rights and adopting, we'll let you know. So they built an addition onto their home, and they raised him for the next 3.5 years. And he's thriving. He's a little a little 4-year-old who has a sense of the world. He knows who mom and dad are. He knows who his grandparents are and his aunts and uncles and his cousins. And all of a sudden, social services knocks on the door one day and says, we changed our mind. We're going to move him and place him somewhere else for adoption. And I can't tell you how shocked and appalled everybody, not only that family, but that community was. So frantic calls to us to say help. And we did everything we could, from talking to the guardian ad litem, from trying to engage with the court, to the community, the county commissioners. We got the public engaged. And at the end of the day, we had to go to the Supreme Court with an emergency request to stop the move. And it was a miracle that they did. And I remember, like it was yesterday, 2:15 on a Friday afternoon, I got a call from the Supreme Court clerk telling me that he was not moving.
At that time, the work of the center was basically threefold: to be guardian ad litems for children that either came to us directly or that the court appointed us to represent. It was teaching here at DU Law School about child law. And it was teaching and supporting foster parents on their rights.
I taught as an adjunct professor at DU Law School. First, just a course on children's rights, and then we were able to develop a clinical program which basically allowed us to partner with our law students who actually provided representation for children.
Many of whom would actually, after graduation from law school, go to work for her in the Children's Law Center.
So in many respects, when Shari began the Rocky Mountain Children's Law Center, she was upsetting an institutional apple cart.
At one point, she got so frustrated with the courts not doing what was right by kids, she actually filed a lawsuit against the judicial system, which didn't make her very popular among some of the judges.
She took on 3 judges there that were not adhering to the new speedy trial law for children. She took them on so much so that she went all the way to the Supreme Court of Colorado. But yet, as a consequence or punishment, we were blocked, the center was blocked for almost a decade of taking any cases in Denver. They continued to work in other counties all across Colorado, but not in Denver.
You would think that when everybody cares about kids, that we would all be on the same page always.
She was saying we need to up the game in terms of advocacy for children, and that's pushing against a very powerful institution. But because she was tireless, and because she was also very well-intentioned, at the end of the day, she won.
And I'm sure she's upset people and challenged people and angered people, but when you're fighting the way she fights for these children who have no one to fight for them, she's just not going to back down.
And so sometimes those efforts are taken as a personal affront. And it's never my intention. And what I try to do is reframe it and say, it's not about what you're doing or not doing. It's about what this kid needs.
So Shari brainstormed about how do I get back into court and make sure these kids get appropriate representation. And her thought was, let me go to the biggest and best known law firms in town, and recruit these lawyers to represent kids for free.
If you went to law school to do good, you went to law school to make a difference in the world, and you end up in a big firm or a corporation, and you do a lot of good work for your clients, but nothing that's as satisfying for you as you might have hoped. And all of a sudden, you want something with meaning and purpose. That's what we offered. We offered meaning and purpose.
Shari called me one day and said, we've got a difficult case. There are 2 boys. One is 1.5 years old and one is about 6 months old. They're in dire circumstances. Essentially, they were in a crack house. The situation was really bad. At the end of the day, this became a 4-year odyssey to save these kids. We actually went to a termination of parental rights hearing. Sadly, neither of the parents showed up at the hearing, and I still lost the case. So we essentially started over. 2 years later, we finally got to the day, another termination of rights parental rights hearing, and this time the court terminated parental rights. And ultimately, we then immediately proceeded to an adoption. These boys were adopted by the foster family who had had them for a number of years, who loved them, and who wanted them. That adoption day was the greatest day of my career.
Probably during my leadership, we recruited and trained over 1,000 lawyers. They then became this army of professionals that helped us to meet the unmet need.
Shari is fearless about going to the legislature and saying, we need to effectuate change.
One of the greatest accomplishments, actually, in Colorado history with child protection was the establishment of the Office of the Child Protection Ombudsman. And it was my legislation, but it was Shari who had been working on it for decades, actually, prior, with former legislators, with former advocates, and it could never get through. The Office of the Child Protection Ombudsman is an independent office housed in the judiciary that serves as a place where citizens, caseworkers, teachers can go with concerns, complaints, compliments about the child welfare system. So if you're concerned about a child who's been touched by the system, that's a really critical place where people can go outside the system to take their concerns.
I know she went after it with full vigor and was successful in changing the way the system works now.
People have always asked me, how can I do this work for so long without burning out? And I never knew what to tell them, other than I have this fierce fire inside me that says I have to, I must, I want to. For the 4 years I was married, my husband became the answer, because I have this loving, wonderful man in my life, and he fills me up when I'm totally drained.
Bob was another sort of larger-than-life personality, over 6 foot tall, bald head, hulking type of a guy. But he was silly, he was kind, he was incredibly funny.
I married Bob Otto when I was 50 years old. I met him because he was my personal trainer. He loved me and I loved him, and it was one of the best things that ever happened in my life. We were married for 4 years when he was diagnosed with some rare autoimmune disease that gave him 6 months to live. And so I knew that I needed to focus on him. And although I didn't stop working altogether, I certainly backed off and delegated a lot of my responsibilities to others.
We missed her terribly. The team at the time did a great job of keeping things going in her absence.
After my husband passed away, I can't even describe it. It was, it's a shock to everybody to lose somebody really special in their life, but I had so little time with him. And I guess what I think about is just how magical it was. It was magical every single day. Had we been together 20 years, maybe it would have gotten less magical. I don't know. But I loved that it was so special. And everybody knew we were so in love.
Once he passed away, she threw herself back into what she knows best, and that's the cause that she's been fighting for multiple decades.
My board of directors did a Herculean job in filling the gaps and trying to raise money and give money so that they could manage things while I was away. And then when I did return, we had like a $400,000 shortfall. There was one board member who basically questioned the viability of the organization over the long haul. And it was as if a light bulb went off, and there was no way I was going to let anybody suggest that somehow this organization couldn't go on. I was prepared to do whatever it took, not only for the clients that we were serving, but also for the staff that were giving blood, sweat, and tears to this agency and these children for years. I mortgaged my house so that we would have cash flow. Basically asked the board what I needed to do. They said raise the money. I had 3 months to raise $400,000. I raised it, And then it was about a year or a year and a half later that we got an anonymous $1 million donation and renewed my faith in the world. And we were able to actually keep that in reserve for probably 10 years.
Over the last 40 years, Shari and the Rocky Mountain Children's Law Center has positively impacted the lives of 20,000 kids, if not more.
I just had incredible opportunities along the way. I was invited to speak at national conferences. I had a chance to speak in some foreign countries. And so there were about a dozen kids that I traveled with. One in particular spoke to 500 lawyers at the ABA meeting and blew everybody away.
I grew up in foster care basically from the age of 8 to 16 and a half. I went through 12 homes from 8 to 12 years old. And so having that experience of being placed in a stranger's home in 12 separate occasions, it was easy to become non-trusting of people around me or to become hardened.
What Shari's been fighting for her entire career is to shift the narrative about foster care in America.
Children are not furniture. You know, children can't just be picked up and moved around like a chair, and you can't just put it into a brand new room and expect it just to be perfect and beautifully behaved. These are young minds and young hearts and young souls. And unfortunately, if they do get shattered at that age, it's difficult to repair that. And we don't want to produce kids like that. We don't want to produce shattered children because they turn into shattered adults. And those shambled and shattered adults make poor decisions. And, you know, and then their life is basically gone before they even had a chance to start it.